Just like get up there and talk. Yeah.
We are nonpartisan.
Okay. Are you ready? Okay. I'd like to bring the meeting to order of the City of Monona Plan Commission, Monday, October 10th, 2022. Would you call the roll?
Chair Moore.
Here.
Alder Holmquist. Here. Mr. Holmberg.
Here.
Ms. Fox.
Here.
Mr. Stein.
Here.
Mr. Grice.
Here.
Ms. Fallett.
Here.
And Mr. Conrad is excused.
Thank you. I'd like to take a minute to thank everyone and thank Brian most especially for chairing in my absence. With that, we'll go for approval of the minutes for September 26, 2022.
Move approval.
Second.
Any changes, corrections? Yes, Chris.
On page 5, at the very end, it's awkward and it doesn't read like what it really was. It makes it seem like the first item is part of the second item. It's confusing. So if we could just say Mr. Homburg requested information on who is completing the Pier 37 EV charging retrofit, period. And then, how to do it, that the commission should discuss if information should be provided to existing developments struggling to rent second floor commercial. Space about the possibility of transition of use, because the whole point was the ones that are struggling to rent second floor commercial, if we should have, not that you should contact them right away, but that sometime we could have discussion if that would be reasonable to allow them to make some type of converted use other than commercial.
Got it. Thank you.
Great. Anything else? Okay, hearing nothing, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
The minutes are approved. The appearance section, do we have any appearances this evening?
I don't believe so. Nobody registered.
Okay, great, thank you. I don't see anybody on Zoom. We'll move to unfinished business, of which there's none. And then we'll go to new business, a public hearing on the request by Ignite Glass and Gifts, represented by Sign Art Studio for approval of a new wall sign at 6009B Monona Drive, case number S015-2022. I'm assuming that Drew is the person that's here. Drew, welcome.
Thank you.
What would you like to go ahead and share? The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just get that shared here real quick. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
We can.
Perfect. So yes, we're proposing this illuminated wall sign here. There were some concerns from the review that were provided about the size that's being proposed. So the initial box dimensions were 11 foot by 4 foot to 4 foot 2. We've decided to identify just the actual area of the sign itself, represented by this dash line here, and that came out to 30.5 square feet. We've added the dimensions of the available tenant space here so that the sign scales correctly, and that way we can give you kind of a representation of how it looks to the other signage on this storefront here.
Okay. Anything else you would like to share with us about it before we close the public hearing?
No, those are the main details to consider there.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you. And I assume there's nobody else here to speak on the public hearing. So we will close the public hearing section and move to consideration of action on the request by Ignite Glass and Gifts, represented by Sign Art Studio, for approval of a new wall sign at 6009B Monona Drive, case number S-015-2022. Doug?
Thank you. So, as mentioned, the request here is for a new wall sign for one of the tenants on Monona Drive here. The sign itself, as originally measured, would be just short of 46 square feet. It's an LED illuminated cloud cabinet with channel letters, and this would be facing towards Monona Drive. The zoning for this parcel is retail business, RB, and the standards for that allow for 1 square foot of signage for every linear foot of building facade length. The field verified measurement, and the applicant included that as well, 27.5 feet of linear frontage. And just of note, the applicant currently has, the business currently uses window signage but does not have any wall signs. This would not be replacing. This would be additional new signage for the center. It's a multi-tenant center, and so just the exact positioning of this should also be clarified with the commission as to whether it is centered above the space or above the window, which would differ ever so slightly. This would also be reviewed. It is also part of the Monona Drive Urban Design Guidelines, and as it relates to signage, it states that commercial signage should reflect a balance between allowing adequate signage for business identification, legibility, and visibility while protecting the aesthetic of the overall streetscape. And so the main discussion point here is really the sign measurement. I had worked with the applicant. It was a little bit late just in the process, and I'll take responsibility as staff for that, but we've been working to get these materials to present to the meeting this evening. The signage, correct me if I'm wrong, Drew, but the signage itself has not changed in any way. It was just really the presentation for the exception. And so the request here, I asked for the clarification in terms of the measurement itself for the sign as to whether it's per the code, it would be the smallest rectangle possible that would encompass the sign. But he did clarify, just given the shape and the design of the sign, the square footage as well. I thought that would be a useful, at least a discussion point for the commission to consider. So really, the main point would be to consider the potential possible exception to the square footage and to the area of the signage. If the commission chooses to do so, there is a approval with finding of fact and conditions of approval included in the staff report as well. That's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to commission members, Drew, can you, or for that matter, Doug, do you know if there is any kind of complex sign agreement? Oftentimes, obviously, that we've previously approved for an entire complex, and I just didn't know if there's any.
I did not see one for the center. I reviewed the vet clinic just to the north, as well as the SWAT restaurant, some of those materials, and I did not see a comprehensive sign plan.
Okay.
For this.
Thank you. With that, I will open it up to the commission. Susan, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a nice looking sign, and I think it makes sense to reconsider the size based on the actual size of the sign. So, I mean, that makes sense to me to go with the 30.5 square feet. It's still a little bit large, but I guess I don't have a lot of concern about that, given that it does look to me to be consistent with the other signs on the building. And there's one we had approved earlier where we made them do it smaller, and every time I drive by it, I think it looks a little odd. I mean, I kind of like it when it fits appropriately to the other signs that are there. I like where it is in the sketch. I guess that would be a question to ask: will it be situated similar to the drawing, where it's kind of over the window? It looks like it's sort of centered in the space, or more centered in the space? Asking the applicant.
It will be centered to the available space there. That is the intention.
Yeah, and I think that also makes sense. I like that positioning because then it frees up the other space to the unit next to it. So yeah, I don't have any other concerns really. I think it looks nice.
Great. Thank you. Ryan?
I think the sign looks good. When it gets to the measurement, although I understand and I agree that the kind of taking in connection of the square footage of the sign itself, although it's desirable, I think having something that equally can be applied to any sign that comes forward to you, I think that's not an easy task to do, of what fits within that, especially when we have things such as like watermarks that are behind a sign. Where does that count? So I still think the smallest rectangle that you can put around is a fair way to do the measurement. I agree that when you have a strip center that has different size frontage, it becomes very challenging if our code is matching it by frontage, you end up with a much larger sign to a pretty dinky sign.
Yeah.
And I think that's what helps in the future if we have some strip malls that are looking, when you have signage bands, I think it helps identify, so then there's some consistency across. But with all that said, I think it looks consistent on the building, the placement looks correct. It doesn't look like it's out of proportion with some of the other signage on the board and building. And I would have all of that as a consideration in the finding of fact.
Thank you, Brian. Brendan?
I agree with what's been stated so far. I think that in context, the sign looks appropriate and makes sense. I know Chris has, I think, a lot of good perspective on some of the precedent that we set with how we exercise our opinion. I'm not particularly fond of just approving an exception to the size of a sign, but in context for this, I think that if it were to follow the letter of the code, I think it would look odd. For the narrowness of the frontage, it would end up being, I don't think that would end up looking very good. So I would rather see this sign, but that's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Rob?
I don't have a whole lot to add. I would agree with what Brian, his kind of breakdown of it. I think it's appropriate for this particular sign is appropriate for this particular spot in this case. And that, I think it looks
Okay.
good. in
Corey?
context.
I think the sign looks good and agree with what's been said.
Okay, thank you. Chris?
Question. Your staff report says that they're individual channel letters. It sure doesn't look like it from what we have. It looks like a cabinet sign.
I believe I was going off of the notes on the sheet. Maybe the applicant could clarify that, please.
Sure. So these are individual letters. It's just that you're seeing them against a white panel that if you look at the section detail of the side view, you'll see there's a detail marked A, and that is a thick, 1/8-inch thick white aluminum backer panel that these individual letters are mounting to.
Okay. That was a little hard to tell, but I understand. So what I see in the black are the individual pieces that you have and lit.
Correct.
Terrific.
Correct.
First thing I thought when I saw this was it's too big. I mean, this is a small space. It's 11 foot long and 4 feet high. That's a big sign. And I still think it's a big sign. But when I went down and looked at the center, every sign in that center is double stacked. Mm-hmm. And so they're all really tall. So when I looked at that, I thought, yeah, maybe this is in proportion with other signs there, and then that's the big exception for me, because typically we don't need an 11 foot long, 4 foot high sign for a 27 foot frontage. That's just overpowering.
Yeah.
But I think it helps when you see the whole context, and I would ask maybe in the future if we get from the applicants, they could give us a picture of the whole center instead of just the one they're next to. Because sometimes it's hard to get a sense of the entire, how it fits with the center without seeing it all. Driving down there, they're all tall. They're all big signs. So I think I'd be comfortable going along with the exception because of the other signage on the center. And we can certainly say, because it's such an irregular shape, I 100% agree with Brian. We can't start saying, well, we'll do a box on this one, but you don't have to do a box, and you can do a box, but you don't have. I mean, that'd be a nightmare for Doug. I mean, we have a sign code. We need to do things according to the sign code, and if there's reason to make an exception, then we make an exception.
Right. Okay. Great, thank you. With that, do I have, unless there's any other comments, do I have a motion?
I would move to approve.
Great, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Brendan, just as a point of clarification, did you want to move to approve with the findings of fact?
Yes.
And that would be my assumption too, in second.
Yes, I would move to approve the findings of fact.
Okay,
And conditions as written.
Yes.
great. Okay,
And the recommendations as written.
terrific. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Thank you, Drew.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, have a good night. Thanks.
You too. With that, I will move to item number 6C, discussion of housing data and potential housing studies, case number 2-028-2022. Before I turn it over to Doug and before we start the discussion, I just wanted to say I did, in fact, watch the last few meetings in full since I've been back. And as I said to Chris earlier, the only thing worse than sitting through a 4 or 5 hour meeting is watching one on Zoom. So I just want to say I appreciate all of your efforts while I was away on business and the discussion, and I also appreciate us beginning anew, if you will, with the discussion, and I appreciate all the work that Doug put in already to set the discussion up, if you will, with a little bit of an overview. So go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, this will be very brief, just kind of touching on a couple points from the memo. So this is in response to the Plan Commission request from the September 26th meeting, and sort of building on some discussion that's happened throughout the summer, I would say, on this. Much of the document was intended and is intended to promote discussion, offer direction, as well as for future discussion, research, maybe other opportunities as well. So a few things I did just want to kind of capture in the document. So the demographics had come up in discussion between the decennial census and the American Community Survey. I went into a little bit of detail there in the memo just to give some background about that, some of the parameters and the frequency and some of the benefits and challenges to each of those data sets, as well as just running through some suggested data points that may be of interest, and again may help to inform some of that discussion, and then kind of leading into the possibility of some projections to begin to look forward, as well as opportunities for additional surveying. Finally, I did want to include some of the studies. Some I think most will be very familiar with, but I think a couple others are a little more hidden away on the website. So definitely some nighttime reading, I think they were described as previously. But each of those will link to the city website, and those links will remain active. So anybody that wants to reference those even further down the line can absolutely do so. That's really it from me. Happy to answer any questions.
Great. So it seems to me as I was listening, well, first of all, I should relay to everyone that Doug and myself and Mark Hodeker, who's serving as interim city administrator, and the mayor sat down and talked about how realistic it was to do a housing study, an updated housing study in kind of the immediate, short term, which is not to say that we would do it in the next month, just to say, how soon could we get it on the plate? And I think it's safe to say that I'm here in part to save Doug and the staff from themselves, which is to say, like, some of the communication, I get up at 4 in the morning, and some of the communication I get from him is even earlier. So, we just want to be realistic on behalf of the staff in terms of the current load. As you can imagine, we've looked at a lot of, as you know, our load has been heavy because we're looking at a lot of development proposals right now. And for every one of those development proposals, it's a ton of work on his part. And we've already shored up the office by hiring an additional staff person part-time, but he just started, right? So I just want to be realistic about, acknowledging that we definitely know that we have it on the plate. We know how important eventually it will be to do a new housing study. But I think where we need to focus is, what do you think would be helpful for our deliberations in the shorter term, recognizing that we can't do it right away. I mean, besides the fact that he's got a ton on his plate, we're short-staffed because we don't have a city administrator either. We have an interim who's really doing 2 jobs. So with that, it seems to me, in listening to the meetings and also, being part of the discussion before I left, because we've brought up the whole issue of condo versus apartment on numerous occasions. It seems to me that what we were talking about is housing mix in Monona, right? And then what came up the last time was market trends, because we were hearing from developers that the trends were for smaller places, for not as much parking, for rental over ownership, for architects not necessarily wanting to design condos. I mean, we're hearing a variety of things in terms of housing trends and market trends around housing as well. So unless I'm missing, is that summarize the 2 things that people think would be helpful? I mean, in as sort of key words, if you will. So then the question, it seems to me, becomes, what data, in terms of Monona and also in terms of market trends, what data would be most helpful to this group in both of those arenas? We can take one, we can take, one at a time. Housing mix. I mean, are we looking for the number of apartments versus condos versus single family, and what's been approved over the last 10 years or since the last housing study? Or what do you, I mean, when we think about housing mix, what are we looking for?
Yeah. I'm just wondering if we could back up for a minute and talk about what our purpose is, in the sense that we don't have the authority.
That's right.
To restrict certain
That's
kinds
right.
of development.
That's right.
These are private property owners.
That's right.
Who find developers and bring a proposal.
That's right.
And, we can talk about things like density and that sort of thing, but I don't think as a plan commission, and I think we heard the mayor say the last time, that's really a city council thing, and it's a comprehensive plan, strategic housing plan, kind of
Right.
a piece of that.
Right.
It's a much bigger process, and we don't have that authority. I think if we have concerns, we can talk with them about it, but I guess I'm not sure, because I agree with this. When I saw this list, I thought, wow, this is a lot of interesting stuff, but it's also a lot of work. And I thought, well, what really is our point to ask staff to put in that kind of work? And,
Right.
We do hear, that there is clearly a demand for apartments. I have a son who's been looking right now. It's pretty hard to find one that's affordable. Market trends in terms of rentals, because we are hearing that these mixed-use buildings, when we put commercial space, the commercial space is often not renting very well. You can look at Cottage Grove Road, the new development that is there, that's not filling. There's, I don't think, anything in the commercial space. So I don't know, and then if we've heard different messages about the financing from banks, because I heard it again in a discussion the other day that banks are not as interested in funding projects that involve condos and mixed, it's just a harder thing. And I don't know that for a fact, because we've heard different things. We've heard that from a few developers, and I've heard other people say, no, that's not true, so I don't know. But I guess I just want to know what we hope to get from this first.
Right. So I'm going to take it one step further, because I completely concur, Susan, that it's not this body's purview to determine a mix, right? There's nothing in the ordinances it's really not our purview. I mean, we've all expressed that, gee, wouldn't it be nice to have some condos come in front of us instead of apartments? But it's not our purview to decide what that mix is. And I also, I have to say that as chair of the Plan Commission and having served on the city council for the last year, for the last, now coming up on 6 years, I'm pretty excited about all the proposals that are coming forward. Like the fact that there's this much interest in Monona, and on Monona Drive in particular, where, and Broadway, where, clearly when we redesigned Monona Drive and invested as much as we did in Monona Drive, we were hoping that that was going to spur new development. And so, and I don't want our discussions of housing mix or to be to any way, shape, or form reflect that we somehow think that one option is a lesser, lesser thing. That apartments are somehow lesser, or the people that choose apartments are somehow lesser. Or in any way want to, I don't think we want to be unwelcoming to developers. I think we want to be welcoming. And frankly, Chris, you mentioned at the last meeting that you knew some people that are doing, condos, and I would say encourage them to come to Monona, because we can only review what's in front of us, right? If if people that are doing condos are coming here, and if anybody knows of developers that are doing that, by all means, have them, have them take a look at what might be available. But I want to be careful that we're not in any way, in the discussions, that we're not in any way reflecting like I said, some sort of, a lack of welcome or a lack of interest, for those people, for the proposals that are coming forward, whatever they, and I know that that's not, I know that that's not this body. I'm just saying I could see where our discussions might be taken as somehow seeing apartments as, somehow a less desirable thing, and I don't know that that's the case.
I feel like we're getting I'm getting the impression that that's the what we've given out to the public is
right.
That apartments are a less desirable space, and I don't think that's true.
Right.
I think it's more about finding a balance of housing types in our community.
Yep.
And we can only judge what's coming in front of us, but we're a landlocked, limited development area community. We've got uniqueness, and I know we're not discriminating what we see coming in because we judge it based on its merits. So I don't know how to participate to some degree in this, because I think the idea, if we're talking about doing a housing study for the city of Monona, we want to set forth goals, or is it just data gathering? Because ultimately we want to use that information to make decisions to build housing types or different diversity in housing types and affordability ranges in our community. So how do you get from one to the next? Like, how does one get you to the next place? If that makes any sense at all.
I appreciate that. Corinne?
I have, unrelated to Rob's comments, so I don't know if we want to go with his first or come back to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not certain how the housing study, which would be something that would be obviously contracted and approved by the city council, and as most planning is, and that's where it really lands. I'm not sure how it would inform what we do. I mean, I think the comprehensive plan, as well as the previous housing plan, obviously laid out a lot of, I think I have it here somewhere, suggestions for Monona, right? In terms of small lot, single-family housing and you know, a refreshing of multifamily housing. I mean, if you look at, I mean, if you choose to read all those plans in your nighttime reading, you know, actually a pretty healthy percentages do reference the preference of rental for a lot of people. That's increasingly shifting, and in fact, even in terms of market trends, I did a little bit of Googling and found out, in fact, that there is a shift in interest in rentals. So, which is to say, some of what we're hearing from developers seems to be bearing out. But to you know, to answer your question, Rob, I'm not exactly sure how it would change our work, and part of the reason why we don't want to rush into it is we want to take a look at studies, because of course the last time we did a study was quite a while ago, and we're assuming that the you know, the methodology behind the studies that are done now, just as housing has changed, the methodology is different now too. And we want to make sure that whatever study we do, we're looking at the right stuff that can be most helpful to the whole city, not just to this group.
If I just put
Yeah,
a
go ahead.
pin on that, I'm a little unclear what a housing, like, is there an avenue to doing some sort of study or comp plan amendment that gives more decision-making to any city body in regards to development types? Or is it just a matter of fact that we are going to get developers coming forward, and if it's zoned appropriately for apartment buildings, they're going to offset the property lines and build a 4-story apartment building with underground parking? And that's what we're going to see. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's what, and then we can go back and forth about architectural styles and density. But is there any roadmap to where we can say we want to get condos, we want to get more affordable housing types, and maybe we can't. Maybe that's just it's overstepping government.
Yeah, no. I think that, my understanding, certainly from talking to Doug and from talking to Brian when he was city administrator of economic development, you know, he was regularly talking to developers, and I think that the city can certainly reflect in its planning its interest in the whatever housing mix is there. Chris?
If I could kind of answer to what Rob said, and part of it is a disagreement with what was said earlier.
Okay.
Plan Commission absolutely does have the authority to look at housing types, absolutely has the authority to look at zoning types. We're actually statutorily required to look at all that, put together a comp plan, and make a recommendation to the city council on what it is. That's our job. If our job isn't to figure out what goes where in the city, what is our purpose? That is our purpose. And as far as Rob's saying, well, if they keep coming with one type of improvement, no matter what it is, apartments, condos, we'd be having the same discussion if we just zoned 1,000 condo units, being worried about too many condos and not enough rental. But we have the authority because every time they come, we're changing zoning for them. It's not zoned multifamily. It's not zoned that way. It's not intended to be that way. Our comp plan doesn't show it. Our zoning maps don't show it. So every time they come, we are requesting that the city council allow another change to allow more multifamily. So we're absolutely enabling it, and we absolutely have the authority to not enable it if we choose. Now, everything we do can be appealed to the city council as it should be. So elected officials make the final decision, but we have to make recommendations on what these things should be. So your question about what authority we absolutely have the authority.
Well, I'm not
to
saying
make recommendations.
Yeah, no, I'm not, and I'm not saying, Chris, that we can't say, you know, this type of development makes sense for this area, or we think it makes sense for this area based on the zoning or based on adjusted zoning. But what I'm saying is that I don't think that we can, that it's at the purview of this committee to say to a developer, well, we like your development, but unless it's condos instead of apartments, you can't be here.
You're right about that, but it
And
is our
that's
purview.
what I
is
meant, just to
top-
clarify.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
because that was the statement that was made at the last meeting, because we
Right.
might just not approve
Yeah.
apartments anymore, and I
But,
thought,
but it is our purview to change commercial zoning to multifamily. We're kind of going around the corner. We're doing CDD all the time and putting in a token amount of commercial and saying, well, we're just making it CDD, and we're putting in basically a residential development with a token amount of commercial. That's a big zoning change. That's a big change to everything we have in our comp plan. And it's certainly, we're monolithic, and it's always one type of housing. And why I brought up some of this is because we want diversity in housing, and we're not getting it in the last 10 years.
Well, I think that that's changed some, because, we've more recently approved townhomes and, a neighborhood, if you will, that's affordable housing, and
So a total of maybe 20 units compared to, 1,000 units of apartments?
no, but didn't you talk about Metcalf's condos that he built? Wasn't in that in the
Yeah,
last?
that was, you remember? Goodness, gotta be at least 10 years ago
That's
now.
past.
Way more.
Or-
more
Yeah,
than that.
15? Yeah, it's been a long time.
Corey?
I was having similar thoughts to what Chris just talked about as far as the zoning. I mean, there've been I've only been on this now for a few years, but, we've had some discussions about rezoning, and we've had to really look at what's in our comprehensive plan, and we've also acknowledged that since that comprehensive plan has been adopted, we have had very strange things occur in our world. And so, we have had a number of questions about moving forward. Developers have come to us with ideas about, well, they're looking at market trends and here's what they're seeing, and that's why they're proposing what they're proposing. But we don't have the same flexibility to look back. Our comprehensive plan is our comprehensive plan, and that's what we have to use, which I understand, but maybe we can have the comprehensive plan and a set of information that is supplemental that we can use as well as we're looking at making these bigger land use decisions. And we're also, I think some of it that I was thinking about is, we are making some assumptions about what people want or don't want, and I think that was pretty clear with what's the name of the, I can't remember the developer name, over behind the Shell station, but how we had that conversation about how some of us were uncertain about the location for residential, and they were talking about, well, that's your perspective, that's your experience, and you don't know what other people might want in terms of where they're living. And so I do feel like we think that maybe condos or townhouses or something would be nice because we want that mix, but maybe it is changing, like you said. So we don't have any sense of what actually is happening out there in the world, and whether or not that affects whether we can say yes or no. I think it gives us context for making these bigger picture decisions or recommendations.
So that speaks more to the issue of market trends. than-
That's a question that I have, yes.
Okay. And so, as it relates to market trends, what would be helpful for you, do you think, for you to see in terms of market trends?
Well, you have a number of things on here, I think, that are potentially useful. I'm also thinking about it from the commercial perspective. Like Chris said, we might look at a building and there's a small amount of commercial, and we ask them to do more.
Mm-hmm.
But then the applicant last week said, well, what had been a reasonable amount of commercial in the past is now too big. Like, we don't know that information, so we're asking for something that maybe if they were to make the commercial size bigger, then it would sit vacant like it is over on Cottage Grove Road.
Right.
So we want whatever is developed and built here to be full and successful.
Sure.
And if we don't know, if we're just making suggestions based on what we think is the right answer, I don't know that that's going to, like, they have a professional, more data, I think,
Right.
than we do.
Right.
It's hard for me not to imagine that the universe is changing, literally. I mean, as we all know, just even with COVID, right, with people working at home, more people working at home, and office space being vacant and all of that. I mean, I think that some of that is still sorting out. But but again, we're happy to do research on any market trends. Like, for instance, I know, and I'm sorry to say that it's a piece of paper I thought I had, but I didn't bring tonight, that I just did a little bit of Googling myself, and the younger generation, I shared the data with Doug, but there's and with the mayor, but basically the younger generation is definitely leaning towards rental over, ownership of homes, which to a certain extent makes sense because, there's all kinds of articles out there about younger people not wanting a lot of stuff and not wanting to be tied down, and, in the same way that there's, I'm sure, information out there about the use of zip cars. There's information out there. There's information out there about all kinds of things in terms of market trends. The number of parking spaces that people need, whatever. So I'm just trying to get a sense from this body of what information would be helpful for this group to provide you with the landscape that you're looking for. Is it back to, yeah, Chris?
I think the list that Doug put together is very inclusive. It goes over everything. It's a wonderful wish list, but it's a lot of information.
Yeah.
To me, we do that as we do the housing section or whatever of our comp plan when we redo it. I mean, that's ambitious.
Right.
You didn't leave many stones unturned when you came up with ideas. When
Yeah.
I asked for something, I just want us to have our eyes wide open
Yeah.
on what we're doing. And all we're doing right now is rental. I have nothing against rental. What I'm worried about is if we change, we have that limited amount of land, what do we do once we've all developed all the one housing type? I did less than 15 minutes of Googling, and I think I landed on the same website that Eliza had. I was trying to find the one that Sonia used because it's totally different, but basically if you look at it, we probably had on, I don't know if it was this census or last one, around 4,000 housing units in Monona. I think that's pretty much about where most of the places say we're at. Mm-hmm. For what we just approved or are approving or what's been approved but not filled out yet by the 2020 census, I said, how many have we approved, right? Mm-hmm. And that was the question. It's got to be approaching 1,000 units now. Mm-hmm. So what my point is if we've got 4,000 housing units and now we've added 1,000, give or take, of one housing type, that's 25% of what we had before. And where we used to be, it depends on where you go, anywhere from 59% to 52% owner occupied. Now we're flipping that dynamic to maybe around 40-some% owner occupied. It's a change in the dynamic of Monona, for sure. Now, I have no question about apartments are hot right now. And they are the biggest place to make money. So any developer, if they have a chance, they will come in and ask for apartments because you can make money, and the vacancy rates are incredibly low right now. And so I don't begrudge any developer for wanting to come in and put up apartments. But we as Monona have to say, is that where we want to be then? Where we're just going to develop all the land we have left and put it into rental and, whatever it comes up to for our, what it changes the city dynamics, it is. And when you look at the numbers, that's a lot. When you add 1,000 units to 4,000, it's all in one housing type.
It's one housing type, but I would argue that, of course, it's very different and increasingly different by design, by virtue of what we've approved, in terms of the level of amenities, and the sort of, obviously, the workforce housing is very different than Traceta and the riverfront, as an example. And, Fairway Glen is very different, and being all residential on Monona Drive and having no commercial, very different, than some of the other units we looked at. And obviously, what Chris and Populance brought forward is very different.
Well, is that Monona Garden?
Monona Garden,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
Monona
totally
Garden,
different
that's
housing
totally
type.
different,
That's-
right,
that's-
totally different housing type. So I think there is some diversity there, I guess is what I'm saying.
Wasn't that still potentially owner occupied?
And that, exactly,
Wouldn't
we
be.
talked about that. In fact, he talked about
But
that.
that's-
We brought it up with him, and he was more open, which is great. Again, I'm not suggesting that we can't raise it. I'm just suggesting that we don't want to discourage development, is my point.
I have a specific.
Yeah.
I don't know if there is information about it, but if there is market trends for seniors looking to move out of their single-family housing.
Demand rises among seniors to rent rather than own, Washington Post within the last 6 months.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you don't have to go that far. I mean, it was in our strategic housing plan from 2007. It was one of the specific goals with, I think, 4 or 5 sub-goals.
Right.
Was specifically that, and it had to do with actually home ownership and the transition of willing sellers to willing buyers. And the willing sellers, do they have spaces within their
Community.
local community that they can move into? Which caused a lot of development that we did do.
Right.
And that was why we had a lot of the senior housing go up. If it's getting back to the piece of like what is it that we're hoping for that can help, one, that strategic housing plan and the update in 2016, those two I think help paint a pretty good picture of some of the goals that have been listed before, which help drive some of the decision making when it comes to zoning changes, because that's where there is some ability at this group to be able to kind of look at when we do have proposals. And I'll go back to the one on the White Horse property. It's a major commercial space that this body said we're going to switch it and we'll put residential there. That has a major impact that you can't undo. We're not going to take a residential space and flip it the reverse. One other piece that we've talked about in the past, which was that home ownership, owner occupied versus rental. And we talked about the 60-40 and when that flipped, which I think was somewhere around that 2010, 2016. We had that conversation about you have a different dynamic when you have a switch over. And a lot of that actually had more to do with our rental in single-family homes, which was a number that we were tracking for some period of time, because we had goals around how can we influence and invite people to want to move into these single-family homes that need significant improvements, or to look at how is it that you can redevelop single-family homes into multiple home units. So the Ganser property was a good example of that. Rather than taking single-family homes, turning them into flip rentals that don't establish a sense of community. So I think the discussion that we had here regarding home ownership versus rental, or the idea of what, and this is where I'm not sure if there's a difference in understanding the momentum or length of time with your rental. So I saw in some of your kind of wish list here was that idea of like, how long is it that you're maintaining in that rental? It might actually be longer than someone that's in an owner-occupied unit, which I think is some of the shift or some of the trend different pieces of people are, sure, they might choose to rent, but they're actually a long-term rental, but not in that, the new term of long-term rental. They almost equate more of an owner-occupied, even though they're renting.
In fact, one of the trends, Brian, in that regard is that, in fact, you mentioned it at the last meeting, as you know, as Brian mentioned at the last meeting, you know, we have had some discussion around Airbnbs and, you know, because we're finding there's a lot of people, understandably, it's a trend, you know, renting their houses in that way too. And, you know, interestingly, when I went back and started reading the housing plan, one of the things that was brought up there was the whole idea of, you know, Monona encouraging the upkeep of housing by providing programs like Renew Monona and other things of owner-occupied housing. And certainly the downside of the Airbnb scenario is that potential loss of community that you just referenced. The upside is that Airbnb properties very often are in better shape and are fixed up because than owner-occupied houses.
Is that
You know,
true? I mean,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
There's studies that have been done that rental properties are better maintained than.
Airbnb type rental properties, yeah. 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 And that's one of the market trends we can dig out, if that's helpful. You know, again, it's a trade-off, and I'm not saying it's universally true, but what I've been reading is that, you know, that can be true, because if you're trying to get, you know, not to mention the fact that some families that are doing, you know, Airbnbs, it's an important strategy for them to stay in their owner-occupied home, because the cost of housing has become so much higher. I mean, you know, I have friends that here in Monona, as I'm sure you all do, you know, that rent out their place every football weekend. Because it's extra cash in their pocket that they really need as a young family, you know, and so. Anyway, so what other trends?
I'll add to the piece of market trends. Actually, I think is only a very small piece of what this body should be equaling, and not using which way the wind blows. That's one of the reasons why we're required to have some of these plans, is so you aren't just responding to the current trend itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's one piece of the multiple parts of the puzzle.
Sure.
So I think having some of that information around housing trends paired with what is it the 4,000 units, and do we really have 1,000 new, rough numbers, right? 1,000 new multifamily rental units? That is that does change the dynamic of what our previous housing plan laid out for us, which should inform us when we are making some of the decisions regarding zoning changes. That and so housing units, type, age, as like one category, market trends as a second category, and then, I mean, I really have an interest in the ownership rental, and in that same kind of bucket, to me, is that affordability piece, which is a different influencing part. It's just because it's a rental doesn't actually make it more affordable.
Right.
There are people that are paying much more in rent
Right.
than they are if they had a mortgage.
Well,
I think it would be important to know kind of the demand for owner-occupied homes in Monona and looking at houses on the market, days on the market, closing prices based on list prices, to get an understanding of what kind of demand is there for owner-occupied. And by, you can go by housing type, but we don't really have a lot of condos to look at, but we can certainly look at what we have.
okay.
That occurred to me too, as someone who just, wanted to stay in Monona and looked for a house for a long time, and watched what was happening. I don't know if like the Regional Planning Commission would have some of this information, but because some of the information related to what you were suggesting, Rob, I think is, are there people that have wanted to buy in Monona that can't because there's not enough owner-occupied unit? Like, that's not something that we can there's no data, I don't think, specifically for that, but there's probably regional data for like how they are, what the search looks like, I guess. And, even some of this information, we're still, I agree that I feel like we're looking at each proposal on its merits, but thinking longer term, we are going to get into a place where we do have to update our plan, and we do have to think about these things a little bit differently. So as we gather information now, I think it's going to help us be able to develop a better plan in the future. And, I think there's maybe one house for sale in Monona right now. I don't know, it's October, but I know people that have wanted to live here that can't, so if we had lower rental apartments that weren't the luxury ones, could they do that until there was a different choice, or if there were townhouses, or, I don't know the answer to that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and please keep in mind, again, I'm not suggesting we wouldn't do a housing study, and we will do a new comprehensive plan. It's required by law. Yeah, and that's not too far away because our last plan was, 2016. So, we will be teeing up a new comprehensive plan that will hopefully provide guidance to this body and every other body.
Well, I think another thing, I think, too, I've heard many stories of people trying to get houses here, but that seems to be a nationwide issue right now. That's not just here. But I'd also like to hear more about trends with parking requirements with apartment units and stuff, because we've heard different things about that too. I know different municipalities are going different directions, and some of that is going to depend on the location of a place and, again, how much commercial's around it. I mean, that was kind of one of the issues with the current with that whole area, was because there was a fair amount of commercial, and a big piece of commercial that has a lot of parking requirement, and then that puts more pressure on the whole area. So it depends on what the whole thing is. But I guess I would like to hear, since we've heard from a few developers that a lot of other communities have different requirements now, how's that working? What is the trend for all of that? To me, that would be useful, because we are going to continue to get these requests. And, I think, I don't know, I'm just guessing we'd probably all like to see a lot more individual housing. I mean, it bothers me when corporations buy up the houses in Monona, and not for Airbnbs, but for long-term rentals, and they're less likely to keep them up the way an Airbnb is. And I don't know that legally there's anything we can do about it. So because we are landlocked, there's just, when you think about where would you put individual houses? Would you build individual houses today on Monona Drive? I don't really think you would.
Right.
So it's like, where do we have where you can do that?
Right.
I don't know that we have that much choice as far as that goes. So,
Right.
I think we have to be realistic about what's here and realistic about what works. And I don't know if that's the project you were talking about, the one on Frost Woods and Monona Drive, where those commercial spaces, I don't even know if they're full yet. I mean, they took a long, long, long time to fill. And I think, we can wish for better, for more commercial, but if the demand's not there, it doesn't happen. So, so I don't know. So it sounds like we're already getting a fairly significant list. So what is the thinking here, though, that we would? Is there some priorities that we could do relatively easily, and other things that would have to be put off towards a contracted study? I mean, I'm not sure where we are with all of that. I've seen Doug taking a lot of notes here, and it looks like you're getting as long a list almost as you had when we walked in. That wasn't what we were hoping for, I think.
No, and I can certainly jump in here. I think there's certainly things, any of the census data, those things can be manipulated fairly easily without needing to contract out. To me, the challenge of that is numbers on a page. What does that tell? And sort of how does that maybe inform the discussion and sort of some of the points that have come up as well. So I think I see these in at least two options. I see the general census data that, I think some sort of deliverable could be presented there that it would at least give a snapshot and maybe look back X number of years, recognizing nuances with data and things at this level of geography, but at least to answer some of those things and ground discussion. But I think concurrently and sort of moving forward would be one of the opportunities here as well. Parking being an obvious one. Another discussion is the conversion of commercial space, or the flexibility that has already been mentioned with possible future developments with regards to that parking. But how does that play with maybe if the developer, ultimately if that commercial space didn't work and if they were to convert that, after an agreed upon time or something. And obviously there are challenges with zoning with that, but if it's in more of a CBD district, there may be options. So I think some of those things, or conversions, or just some of those may add flexibility, and maybe something that, it's things that I ask developers is just how does the interior of one of those spaces differ? And there are pretty big differences between those, but are there ways that those things could offer flexibility that would be almost something that could be tried, and then if it doesn't, or if things evolve over time, there may be opportunities. There are examples of folks, converting structured parking, for example, and closing that, using that as ways for commercial, and these. There are some of those examples, not to that scale, of course, but just I think how does that go into an opportunity or a decision-making process for future projects? But and then to me, the market trends and certainly the forecasts, I think that's where I would be looking, and probably covers a couple of those categories. Would be partnering with the regional planning or different entities in the area, because I think the narrative is important, not just in Monona, but how is it countywide as well, or how is it beyond the municipal boundaries. So that's something that I would be keen to try and include whenever possible. If you are pulling down data for, say, the city, how does that compare with the county? And just have those comparable, at least just for percentage increase or something like that. Because it is, these trends are sort of beyond just the borders as well. So I know there has to be a focus of the city, but how does that relate, I think would at least be interesting to view as well.
Right. Right. And as we talk about all the time, obviously Monona is very different than a lot of the cities that we get compared to, in that we're 100% infill development as opposed to, wide open spaces where, they've got a white canvas they can play with effectively. I know certainly, just to Susan, to your point, I know, one of the housing types that I've been interested in for a long time, but again, it's like where you put it is not unlike the small houses, smaller but not small enough houses on Femrite, the small lot. Because I know those pocket neighborhoods is what they call them generally, know of their success. My mother lived in one, and people that are, again, looking to downsize, or not live in a big house, and like to live in community. It's kind of, those, but, and I've often thought that in terms of adding residential, I've often thought that if you put a few of the big lots, maybe at the end of a street, through the big lots that are 3/4 of an acre to an acre, together, you could conceivably do that. Not as close as the one on Femrite, because the whole idea is to have community space outside too. But anyway, I think that there are, that's those pocket neighborhoods are something that I referenced specifically in the comprehensive plan. There's certainly, ways to mix it up, even within our confines. So, do you think a couple of months? I mean, what do you think in terms of being able to? We want to be realistic about what's on. I know what you got on your plate.
I would say the census data. I think I'd be looking at that sort of a timeline, 2 or 3 months, and that's the sort of thing that we could maybe offline, kind of at least parameters, and maybe there's a draft document or something like that before it is brought for the commission. But I think those elements could be sooner. Ordinance provisions definitely are in the right plan as well for things like the parking, to review adjacent municipalities. How would you quantify car share? How would you look at some of those things, and what sort of reduction could be done there? But also just how does Monona's current parking standard compare as well, outside of any of those other elements? So I see those as well kind of tracking, because I think as each of these developments comes through, there's more and more of those asks coming. So so I see that as a priority. The market trends, the forecasting and those things, having worked in that side of things before, that's going to be more of a closed book, I would say. That's probably the area outside of general publications and sort of scraping that type of information. I think to get specific, that would probably be where the contracting would be the focus. I think the other elements, more local, that is something that can be done in-house. But I think that the trends is probably the bigger element, I'd say.
Okay. All right, great. Chris?
Sorry, 2 comments.
Yeah.
When it comes to commercial, developers will always make more money on apartments, period. It's a no-brainer.
Yep.
The city makes more money on commercial, period. It's not a question.
Yep.
We get more in taxes than we spend for the commercial property. We take less in than we spend for the apartments. So if we don't hold tight, we don't have the conviction of a community to hold our commercial base, all that's going to happen is the existing residential property taxes are going to go up because there's nowhere else to take it. So I think we have to have the conviction of, as a community, that we want to hold on to commercial, because the developers prefer not to do it. They'll make more money putting in apartments. That's a fact. So we need that conviction. So to say, well, if the developer wants this, we might let them, well, that's us giving up then our conviction that we want to hold our taxes down, and we'll go ahead letting them take away the commercial base, which the people before us spent a lot of time building. The second comment would be, I'd be very hesitant to talk to developers about trends in parking. We've been down that rabbit hole, and I know I keep saying it, but I also lived it with all our commercial properties, when the trend in commercial properties years ago was you don't need as much parking, and we struggled with that on Monona Drive for 30 years, trying to get properties back where we had enough parking. And when you listen to the developers come in and say this is the trend, they're talking about the last one did downtown Denver, downtown Madison even. Well, but that's a lot different than a parking demand out here. It's so walkable in downtown Madison and Denver and all these areas they're talking about. That's not us. So all I'm saying is we need to be very careful, because if we all of a sudden start doing it, we find out, oh, we messed up, we need more parking. We have nowhere to get it. There's nowhere to go. So I think just listing the trends is fine, but we have to apply it to who we are and what our areas are. Like the ones where the developers say we want this trend, well, there's no parking on the streets around here. So where is your overflow? Where is your plan B? So I just hope we keep a little caution there, rather than just saying, well, Mr. Developer, what do you think? Because it saves, let's be honest, it saves some money to not put in parking.
Sure.
It's economics.
Sure. And I actually applaud, I think the flexibilities as you guys talked about, when the neutral project was in. I mean, I applaud the flexibility that we provided populace, the Monona Garden site, and I applaud the flexibility. We just talked about some flexibility around some issues that, you suggested, but still having a plan B, when we discussed the neutral project the last time, the Bloom project, because I do think there's some saliency to Nate's comment that, that his development is not the riverfront. I mean, he's right that the riverfront has, between Buck and Honey's and all the other eateries there, and Buck and Honey's obviously has a big special event space, and the park that, produces programming all the time. That's a different level, I think, of. Does it mean that he doesn't, need 30 spaces? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying he's probably right to say that it's not, maybe not, apt comparison, and we'll see what he comes up with. But I do think, as always, I applaud the wisdom of this group to see that, and to suggest, that there could be some flexibility there.
It'd be nice
Something
to have
that would trigger.
experience it 5 years from now and bring it back here so we know,
Right?
right?
Yeah.
We don't have that.
Right.
That would be really nice to see some of these things come to fruition.
Yeah. So a couple other, are we good? I think we're over 40 minutes. Sorry, Rob. A couple other things, just because they were brought up. I have a map of Zipcar in Madison. I know we talked about Zipcar and how viable it was, and so I did a little bit of research on Zipcar. And in fact, like a lot of major universities, they're very active on campus, around campus, for obvious reasons. It's owned by Avis, and they're like 1.5 million members at this point. You get there's a small membership fee, and then you pay by the hour or by the day. But it is a very, as Brendan pointed out with his travels, it's a very common thing. The second thing is Madison Metro. There will be, we talked about transit, and we've heard about bus stops on Monona Drive from a lot of developers too. There's going to be two open houses to talk about the proposal that's been brought forward by Madison Metro at the library, the first one being on the 20th from 6 to 7:30. That's Thursday, the 20th of October. And the second one being from 6 to 7:30 on the 25th at the library as well. And there's another one that's going to be scheduled at the Senior Center. And those are all to provide the community an opportunity to have input into a very specific proposal that's been offered by Madison Metro.
So after 30 years, you may have a deal with them?
Yeah,
Wow, that's impressive.
if we want to take the deal, yeah, we're going to listen to the community
been a long
first.
time.
Yeah, I know. And you know, the route that they're proposing would definitely include increased service on Broadway as well as on Monona Drive, like stops, as an example. Should we close that portion of the agenda? Are we good? If you think of anything else, any other data that you think would be helpful, feel free to shoot it to Doug or myself. Again, we will be planning. We're just not going to do it in the heat of battle here, in the heat of our other work. With that, we'll go to number 7, reports of staff and commission members. Staff report.
In my report, I'll ask the question. Before you dig into too much of that work, would it be worth it to put together, here's what you're thinking of,
Yeah.
and getting it out to folks, just so, I don't want you digging down a path if we realize, you know what, I thought about that, and that's not going to be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly before it's, I think the presentation of this and the packaging of it is going to be just as important. So it could almost just be bullet points on a Word doc and take it from there and then finalize it from that.
It could be great.
Yeah.
In fact, when he sent me the list of all the demographics, I was like, I don't want all this crap. I don't need to know that, the exact age and stage and, whatever of every person in Monona. I mean, how is that going to help me make a decision, So yeah, then why don't we do that? Okay. Great. Thank you, Brian. Okay. Now we'll go to reports.
Thank you. The first thing I wanted to raise was a follow-up to the last meeting. There had been discussion about a potential site visit over to the North Point project, which is the East Broadway development over at the White Horse property. The developer was in touch. They gave a few dates, so I'll circulate a doodle poll just to see what would work best for the commission, and of course post it most likely as a quorum. But just for your calendars, they were thinking before or after lunch, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday next week at some point. So we'll probably just see what works best for the group and coordinate something there for that. Following up to that, upcoming Plan Commission items, I just received the draft, the North Point draft CSM for combining those two parcels into one. Conversations also do continue. The feedback was relayed about the street and that being contingent upon any PIP. So conversations are taking place about that. At the next meeting, we're also expecting, I have a signage application for a retail space on Monona Drive, just a redo of the facade out there, as well as a commercial use over on West Broadway at 605 West Broadway. So that'll be just another pre-hearing. So most likely 2 pre-hearings as well as a consideration of action. And pleased to say the new assistant planner started last Monday, and he will be joining us at that meeting as well. So he'll be coming for an introduction and just to meet you all in person as well. So
Thank you.
that's it for me. Thanks.
In the updates discussion on diversity, equity, inclusion. Anybody? No? Anything on sustainability? Upcoming meetings we've already talked about. Any other plan commission requests for information? Yes. Chris?
I wonder how that sounded. Have you heard any updates from Chipotle? Well, the original one was they were going to be open in September. They're not doing so good with that one. But.
The most recent update was, I think before the end of the year would be
Okay.
about as much as I'm willing to formalize. Still working on some items, but they're making decent progress at this point. But I think September was ambitious. So.
Well, I'm just thinking they don't get pavement down soon. They might not get it down. It might not be till spring then.
Yeah. No, we're in contact, and I know that they're pushing. So.
Okay, thank you.
Any other requests for info? Great. With that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I will move adjourned.
Imagine that. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you.